Hey, good afternoon, friends, colleagues, and welcome to this session on financing and investment drivers for adaptation. I do hope that the number of people in the room is not an indication of the interest in adaptation, but I understand that people are just wrapping up their lunch, and I hope that more friends and colleagues would troop in once we begin. So this particular session aims to look at an overview of existing opportunities, maybe barriers, challenges, maybe more of barriers and challenges, as well as factors that determine the financial flows for adaptation, including a discussion on the overall picture, the overall financial needs, and the possibilities as well for more stakeholders to come into the picture, including perhaps private sector involvement in mobilizing and scaling up finance for adaptation. I'm happy to facilitate this session. My name is Nader Absanyo. I am from the Philippines, and I currently serve as co-chair for the Long-Term Finance Work Program. I believe that's the reason why I was asked to facilitate, and also because part of the mandate of the Standing Committee on Finance is to interact in this forum together with other bodies that and processes that deal with climate finance. We have a very good mix of resource persons in our panel, and we will have the pleasure of hearing from different perspectives. We have Juan Hofmeister from the Adaptation Committee, also from the Bolivian delegation. He would speak to us as a representative of the Adaptation Committee, and we'll hear the perspective of the committee regarding the challenges that we face on adaptation finance. We have Mr. Carlos Fuller from the delegation of Belize. He's the International Regional Liaison Officer of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, and he will give us more concrete examples and experiences from the Caribbean regarding adaptation finance. We have Smita Nakura, a research fellow from the Overseas Development Institute Climate and Environment Program. She will give us a bit of a panoramic view of the lay of the land when it comes to adaptation finance, including a discussion on effectiveness as has been experienced in the recent past. We also have with us Saliha Dobarzik, the climate change specialist from the LDCF, that's the Least Developed Countries Fund, and the SCF, the Special Climate Change Fund Secretariat, and that means she's going to give us more examples and lessons learned from that particular process under the LDCF and the SCF. So I will not even tell you how much time we are behind schedule, because you pretty know that very well. But I would just say that it's a better problem that we have so much to discuss with little time, instead of having too much time and nothing to discuss. So with that, let us begin with this panel. I call to the podium Mr. Juan Hofmeister. Juan?
Thank you very much, Yep, and good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Juan Hofmeister. I am in this occasion today speaking on behalf of the Adaptation Committee. For those of you not aware of adaptation in the convention or the different bodies in the convention, the committee is the overall advisory body to the Conference of the Parties on Adaptation to the Adverse Effects of Climate Change, with the task of promoting action and coherence under the convention on this matter. So in a way, it's the sibling of the Standing Committee when it comes to the issues of adaptation. Let me start by stating some very well-known facts, quite the reality, and that is that the adverse effects of climate change are being felt. They cannot be put off. They're not hypothetical anymore. They're substantial and ongoing, and that makes adaptation absolutely critical. The cost of adaptation is significant, and while estimates vary, and we will hear some of that in this panel, it is clear that there is a need for long-term finance for adaptation. The committee has underscored that the international community cannot think of long-term finance for adaptation without recognizing the linkages and synergies of adaptation with sustainable development. In our work plan, we have agreed to consider several activities on adaptation finance, and we're committed to provide information and recommendations drawing from the good adaptation practices for consideration by the COP and the general community when providing guidance on means to incentivize the implementation of adaptation actions, including on matters related to finance, technology, and capacity building, and other ways to enable climate resilient development and reduce vulnerability. And I say all of this because this is actually quite, perhaps most of it being directed to the Standing Committee itself, because we are, in a way, and for the part of the committee, eager to actually begin working closely in looking at some of the technical issues that overlap in our mandates and our possible contribution. So for some of you that are here today, perhaps not as immersed in that negotiation process, I apologize if some of it might seem tangential. However, there will be a few points that I hope you can also reflect on. Let me also stress Adaptation Committee has underscored in our work some key issues in the context of thinking of finance and adaptation in the long term. The first is the importance of facilitating greater coherence on adaptation finance. This includes a focus in the work of the Standing Committee and the Climate Finance Forum, if established by the Long-Term Finance Work Program on adaptation. This promoting of coherence includes assessing what delivery methods for adaptation finance are being currently used, how those methods can be improved, especially the green, in the context of the Green Climate Fund, through which a significant share of new multilateral funding for adaptation is expected to flow. This also, of course, includes exploring how the adaptation framework can be used to galvanize increased financial resources for adaptation, including from public and private resources. But of course, the real question is how, and that's part of what we're perhaps trying to get to here today. The second issue of importance highlighted by the committee is the need to explore pathways to mobilize long-term finance for adaptation especially. This includes ways in which to explore how to enable the mobilization of long-term public sector finance, ways to address the possible gap in the availability of adaptation finance for the adaptation fund, and the factors that may hinder or enable the private sector engagement in adaptation finance. Key issues, a key issue in that context, of course, it's for the financing of what's known as national adaptation plans, which is a process and how this is being considered beyond 2015, particularly if we consider that right now the financing for this fund mostly comes from the carbon, the carbon levy on carbon price, and considering the current state of carbon price, what are the alternatives then to support the adaptation fund? So in that case, in that context, let me provide some further personal reflections. Financing and climate change. I think it's important that we distinguish in the context of adaptation that financing is not only the transfer of financial resources, but the use of finances to access transfer of technology. Most of climate change financing up to date has gone to mitigation, and that is a fact. That's because mitigation projects are revenue generating, and they do have a return on investment if done well, of course. However, the COP has recognized the need for more balanced distribution and the need to put adaptation on the forefront, and I'm here obviously paraphrasing some COP language. And this needs to be then thought more carefully. And that is what the adaptation committee sort of brings to this group for further consideration. How is it that we're going to go about doing that together as standing committee and an adaptation committee? The reason why the adaptation has often come as a second thought when it comes to guidance on climate finance and the development of climate finance instruments. It is often that first things are developed thinking of greenhouse gas reductions, and then later we add on the adaptation component. And sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work well, but the general sense is that this is not coherent. Earlier, I had heard some questions about how do we understand adaptation. I take the liberty perhaps to actually bring forward the very definition that has been used by the IPCC of adaptation, which basically reads for the assessment report, the adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climate stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. And within that, there are different types of adaptation. So in that sense, I find interesting to see how the private sector perceives this concept. I've heard earlier, for example, the notion of environmental risk management, of adaptation being as a matter of the cost of the losses from the impact, and that's sort of what's understood. And so in that sense, there's clearly a need for a better understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about adaptation. The South Center earlier made a very important point in terms of the diversity of actors in the developing world. And I think this is particularly important in the context of speaking of the barriers, constraints, and drivers for adaptation. When we talk about small and medium enterprises, the reality is that it gets even more complicated when we speak of the adaptation context, because we're going to the very household level, particularly working with vulnerable groups. A colleague earlier, I believe a member of the standing committee, I'm not sure from where, said that thankfully we're sort of going past this old debate of private sector versus public sector, and that this is an important thing. Similarly, the debate between development versus adaptation is sort of being overcome. And these are both good things. However, we need to go actually deeper into what does this mean. Particularly when speaking of vulnerable groups, and what does this mean in the context of a forum like this. When we speak of vulnerable groups like women, indigenous peoples, local communities, and also when we speak of private sector, actually, who are we talking about in the context of adaptation? And there is a need for a broader understanding that actually includes groups like farmer groups, cooperatives, entrepreneurs, fisher folk, etc. And this is key for actually understanding if we're going to have a conversation about the incentives. To start wrapping up, I mean, in once we identified who these different groups are, there are of course different drivers that can be set for these different groups. But the importance here, once again, to recognize the diversity and the fact that that currently the financial instruments that exist are not in place. The financial needs for adaptation, I'm not going to go into numbers, not only because of time, but also because this is slightly pointless in terms of trying to provide an estimate of adaptation needs. Why is it pointless? Well, because it obviously depends on what scenario are we talking about. Are we talking about a 2-degree scenario, a 3-degree scenario, a 4-degree scenario? And depending of which scenario we're talking about, the needs of adaptation are going to be extremely different. So there's a need, of course, to look at adaptation more systematically. And I say this, of course, in the context of the work that the Adaptation Committee and the Standing Committee could do together. Of course, this forum is a useful step, but the Adaptation Committee has urged for consideration of the different provisions and subsequent decisions related to adaptation and finance, and to give some consideration to better understand when and how this can be actually improved to address adaptation needs. Now, in that context, it will be useful perhaps to understand when and how specifically the Standing Committee intends to take up adaptation as part of its overall mandate. And with this, I mean all the way ranging from so that we can understand approaches and case studies better, including on the private sector in providing funding, the use of synergies and how to avoid duplication in the work that both bodies do. For example, the Adaptation Committee will be doing some work later in the third quarter of 2013 on monitoring and evaluation of adaptation. How can we avoid duplication? What can we learn from previous experiences? So there are possible activities, and with this I conclude, having gone a few minutes past my deadline. There are some possible activities that are relevant for how we begin this conversation, because in a way we're just starting this conversation between the Adaptation Committee and the Standing Committee. First is by trying to seek information from the biannual assessments on finance to feed up into some of the work that the Adaptation Committee does. And that's building, of course, on the work that the Standing Committee does as well. There's an opportunity and as a possible activity to engage in a process to jointly look into the challenges of reporting adaptation finance, how to address them, the issues that I have identified, for example, on the things that we don't understand that might be applicable or not in the context of the private sector. Both bodies could also jointly review current financial guidance under the convention to ensure its coherence with the Cancun adaptation framework. The support for LDCs in the NAPS or National Adaptation Process, the support for non-LDCs in undertaking activities related to national adaptation plans, etc. So in conclusion, there is a lot to do. And hopefully from a lot of this work that I have outlined, there is potential for beginning to actually identify some of these areas where it might be applicable and might be relevant to speak of incentives for private sector. But overall, of course, there is a lot of work that we need to do first. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, and for giving us a concrete recommendation in terms of the work that needs to be done. We're really scratching the surface when you talk about adaptation. Now, adaptation has been described as the poor cousin of mitigation, but some would hope that it would be the glamorous twin sister or twin brother of mitigation. But we have a lot of work to do, and there are a lot of challenges we have to overcome. To help us understand deeper what the obstacles would be, or even the opportunities that lie ahead, we'll call on the next speakers to give us more concrete examples and experiences. Now we have Carlos to share with us the experience of the Caribbean community. Carlos.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I would just like to begin by describing the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. It is a regional intergovernmental organization established by the Caribbean Community Heads of Government in 2002 to coordinate the region's response to climate change. It became operational in 2005 with its headquarters in Belize. It really covers 4 areas. It develops and implements projects in the region, provides policy advice to governments, coordinates the Caribbean in the climate change negotiation process, and it responds to requests from governments. We have 15 member states that are members of the center, and it has an independent management. The Council of Ministers of Trade and Economic Development provided with policy advice. There is an independent board made up of public and private sectors to provide strategic advice to it. The center has full juridical personality. That is, it can engage in contracts on its own, and it can acquire and dispose of assets. However, probably one of the most unique aspects of this intergovernmental organization is that it was required to be financially independent. That is, it does not assess its members any contributions, and because of it then, financing is extremely important for us to remain alive. At the present, we use management fees from the various projects we implement to maintain ourselves. We really began implementing projects in the region using SCF World Bank funding, and we went through the three-stage adaptation process recommended by the SCF and the IPCC. That is, in our first project, the CPAC project, it created capacity building among its members. At the second stage, we then created the enabling environment, and through that process, we developed a regional policy on climate change. So the 15 members of the Caribbean community have one policy on climate change. And then finally, having finished those first two stages, we then went to the third stage, that is doing concrete adaptation projects in pilot countries. One of them, for example, was in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where water shortage was identified as an ongoing and will become a more severe problem in the future. And the solution in one of the islands was putting in a reverse osmosis desalination plant. However, in developing that project, it was recognized that it would be very energy intensive. And so we looked at various types of renewable energy that could power it, and after looking at wind for a while, we opted for using solar. And what was unique about it was that we recognized that where the desalination plant was not the best place to put in the panels. And so the panels were put in further upstream, and it was then fed into the national grid. And we provided more power than we needed for the plant, and so the excess power is then sold to the grid, and that funding is then used to maintain the system. So we have a system that should not require any more resources to keep it going. Another pilot was done in St. Lucia, where we worked with a private sector, a hotel and resort that used most of the water in that region, most of the potable water in the region. And so we retrofitted their entire water system, the catchment, using rainwater as the potable water supply by cleaning it, recycling their grey water, which was then used in their swimming pools and to water their fields. And that then became really the showcase for the private sector, because it turns out that we began as a 50-50 mix with public and their own funding. And as the project was developed, it became a bit more expensive, and it turned out to be that the private sector put in 3/4 of the money required for this retrofitting. They are now boasting across the Caribbean that this was the greatest investment they ever made, because it made economic sense, not for climate change, it just makes economic sense with what we're doing. That then became the launching pad for us to then receive other funding through more bilateral means. At the moment, we have a portfolio of about $50 million worth of projects that we're not presently implementing. This includes a regional PPCR through the IDB and the World Bank for the tune of some $10.5 million US. We have a UK International Climate Fund project, about £5 million. We have projects from our regional development bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, for about $500,000 US, which is to prepare a project portfolio for each of the member countries so that they can then take that out into the international community. We're implementing the regional GCCA project of about €8 million funded by the European Union. with the CDKN out of the UK, and we are implementing a risk management project to the tune of some £500,000. And that is really to be able to develop a risk management system that we are now putting in 6 countries at the Ministry of Finance, so that the Ministry of Finance, when they are developing their national budgets, can ask each of the ministries presenting their budget proposals to them, have you taken climate change risk analysis into your budget? That is, I hope that when I look at these projects that you're presenting to me, you're not putting in a school in an area that is vulnerable to storm surge, or you're not putting in a hospital in an area that is vulnerable to flooding. And so that is a sort of system we're now putting in 6 of the countries through that project. With the Carry Week project, this is developing a wind generator, a climate generating system to be able to assess how climate change is going to impact on several countries. And with Australia, some $2 million Australian dollars for work in coral reef monitoring. We are presently working with the GIZ of Germany, developing a €10 million project on ecosystem-based adaptation. So while this is all very well and good, we still have some concerns about the predictability of finance. And it is certainly something that we cannot rely on anything coming out of the UNFCCC process, because we know it takes so very long. So we are really looking at a constant flow of funding through two mechanisms. First of all, we have established a trust fund, which has been initially capitalized by the Trinidad and Tobago Petroleum Fund, and we are seeking further funding to put into that trust fund to be able to use the interest out of that money to then generate more project proposals. And secondly, developing a business arm of the center through mitigation projects. We believe that if we can develop a pilot project at the center in one of our member countries, and using that to generate revenue, we will really be able to show the private sector across the Caribbean that if a center can do it and make it viable, it then makes sense for the private sector in the Caribbean to also implement similar projects in mitigation, because at the moment, attracting private direct investments into the Caribbean in renewable energy is very slow because of the very small scale of the projects that we can attract in the region. And so we really believe that this would be one of the ways of showing the people in the Caribbean that they can use their own funding to make such a case for them. So with that, Chair, I'll end here.
Thank you, Carlos, and also for... Thank you, Carlos, also for pointing out the important synergies between mitigation and adaptation. Now we have, as our next panelist, Smita.
Great. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to provide a little bit of an overview of some of the global climate finance landscape when it comes to adaptation. So in a way, my remarks pick up a little bit on Barbara's presentation from earlier this morning and seek to look in a little bit more detail at the nature of the funding that we now have available to support adaptation in developing countries. And just by way of introduction, I lead our work on international climate finance at ODI, where in partnership with a number of institutions in this room, we've been working to both monitor the delivery of climate finance as well as increasingly to understand the effectiveness of its use. So in my remarks, I wanted to touch on 3 sort of broad issues. One is to sort of reflect on the scale of finance. The second is to reflect on the growing number of institutions that are now involved in the delivery of public finance, before concluding by offering some insights, early insights, into what we think makes for relatively more effective adaptation finance. I think the top line message is actually a relatively positive one, albeit from a modest baseline, and that is that we've seen a dramatic increase in the amount of public finance for adaptation over the last few years as this issue becomes increasingly prominent in international debates. But that increase, of course, takes place from a very low baseline, and it's easy to have rapid growth when you start from relatively low numbers. And on balance, the overall scale of adaptation finance remains modest, and there's a continued need, and I think a continued shared sense of purpose in trying to find ways to make progress in terms of scaling up, recognizing that we have been making some progress in recent years. And I suppose in many of our countries, developed and developing alike, we may have a conceptual appreciation of the need to address climate change, but in many ways it is the imperatives to adapt that have become ever more undeniable, that have added some greater impetus and imperative to some of our efforts around climate action and around mitigation and add urgency to the need to deliver finance effectively. So we've seen a really significant scale-up, actually, in adaptation finance, as I mentioned, in part as a result of some of the commitments that were made during the Fast Start Finance period to deliver increased finance to developing countries with the aim of trying to achieve a greater balance in terms of support for adaptation finance. And over the last year, my colleagues at the World Resources Institute and the Open Climate Network have been trying to look more closely at where it is that some of these Fast Start Finance contributions have actually gone and what it is that it has supported. And when we look at the Fast Start Finance that was delivered by the UK, US, Japan, Germany, and Norway up until about the end of 2011, it is clear that there was at least $2.6 billion in adaptation finance that was delivered, and that, as I say, represents progress. But in balance, when you think of it in the context of the total finance delivered during that period of about $20 billion, it's a relatively small share of the funding, nevertheless. It's around about 15%. So as I say, progress being made, but relatively there's still a little bit of space to go in terms of taking this agenda more seriously. And another observation that stems out by looking at this is that it appears that it's been particularly difficult sometimes to use public finance to mobilize private investment in adaptation-related activities. It has seemed to be much, much easier to do that for mitigation. This is not an epiphany, but I think that this is reflected to some extent in the number breakdown when you look at Fast Start Finance for adaptation, because a lot of Fast Start Finance has actually been delivered using a number of instruments that have been focused on private sector mobilization, and that in turn has affected some of the extent to which more focus on adaptation has been able to be achieved as a result of a substantial reliance on the use of trade and investment promotion kinds of instruments during the Fast Start Finance activities. But of course, there is much more ambiguity about the links between what is good development and what is adaptation. Again, none of this is particularly new, but I think in turn that does make it that much more difficult to identify precisely where it is that investment in adaptation is taking place as compared to investment in other kinds of climate-related activities. We have seen a significant number of adaptation funds emerge in recent years, and I'm not going to speak to the experience of these funds in much detail because we've got representatives of each of those funds who are much more better placed to speak to the experience of their own institutions in this regard. But we do see that there has been a concerted effort in terms of setting up new funds in this space and real opportunities to learn from what they've achieved. Of course, we've got the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund as two of the longest and most established adaptation funds, but we've also had several new initiatives emerge in recent years. The Adaptation Fund, operational now since 2009, developing some very interesting experience and implementation track record. The pilot program on climate resilience, one of the largest sources of public funding, although it exists outside of the direct mandate of the convention, that's really trying to pilot, as others have alluded to previously, programmatic approaches to supporting adaptation. A lot of bilateral activity on these counts, including through the Global Climate Change Alliance, including through bilateral programs that have sought to support dedicated adaptation activities at both regional and country level. And while these initiatives have sought to focus on the needs of the most vulnerable, I think there is a lack of agreement on who is the most vulnerable and how it is that you prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable, and a recognition that there are many different kinds of adaptation. And we are going to have to find different ways to support a diversity of different kinds of adaptation that meet the needs of a diversity of countries. And it is in this context of increasing expectations around the need for delivery of finance and the fact that many of the adaptation funds that we currently have had relatively modest capitalization that we're thinking about the potential role that new mechanisms such as the Green Climate Fund might be able to play in helping to scale up and add some value to existing efforts in climate finance more generally, but around adaptation specifically. And in order for it to add value, it will need to try and do something something new that other existing funds perhaps haven't been able to do. And I would highlight two elements on which there's potential for doing new things. One is in terms of scale, because up until this point, many of the funds that we've been working with have had relatively modest resources at their disposal to do these kinds of activities, and scale affects effectiveness, although it does not determine it. But the other is in terms of the kinds of approaches and partners that it might be able to engage and bring on board in an effort to deliver adaptation at this diversity of levels that I've alluded to as being necessary. And so in that context, I think it's worth maybe taking a minute to reflect on where it is that the current adaptation finance that we have mobilized has gone, so that we can begin to think about the nature of some of those gaps, and where it is that there's room perhaps to think about elements of effective delivery of adaptation finance. And certainly in recent years, we've seen a lot of adaptation finance going beyond our sort of classical stereotypes of what adaptation finance is in terms of building seawalls, towards a much more holistic approach to adaptation that includes disaster risk reduction, food security, more productive agriculture, all of this being undertaken in a context of really trying to think about the linkages between development and climate change in a much more integrated and strategic way. And we see this reflected in the bilateral development assistance portfolios of many of our agencies as well, as they seek to be more attuned to the climate risks associated with investment, and seek to mainstream climate risk into overarching development activities. But of course, mainstreaming and scaling up are complementary, but not entirely the same thing in all cases, and there's a need to keep the sort of balance in mind as we move this forward. We see many pioneering institutional design features for adaptation funds, and those have been documented by others. The Adaptation Fund, for example, has stood out for its innovative approaches to resource mobilization, as well as its innovative approaches to access modalities for funding, by pioneering approaches to direct access, working directly through national institutions that can meet standards for accreditation. And there are many of these innovative design features to adaptation funds, but I think it's worth reflecting on whether we actually continue to have room to push the boundaries a little bit more when it comes to actually implementing adaptation projects, and seeking to, again, think more creatively and more innovatively about how we can actually support adaptation in practice beyond the design of innovative fund mechanisms. And I think in that regard, there's a real need to reflect on the diversity of roles that different actors can play at national level in terms of integrating adaptation into developmental priorities. Processes and institutions matter, for better or worse, and sometimes these things take time to get right. You really need to find ways to ensure that the full suite of actors who might be able to play a role in using what are ultimately inevitably going to be limited resources as well as they possibly can be. And here, again, existing funds such as the Adaptation Fund and others have invested increasingly in trying to come up with good practice guidelines for how it is that you do stakeholder engagement and design, so that you can get those long-run wins through the use of these resources. And I think that's noteworthy and to be built on. And while adaptation, of course, requires strategic engagement with government and close efforts to work through government systems and the mechanics of public financial management, it does also require collaboration with a diversity of institutions at national level, including civil society, subnational level, and of course the private sector, which has come up multiple times in the context of mitigation, but potentially also has slightly different manifestations in the context of adaptation. And here, really thinking about the catalytic role that public climate finance can play in terms of enabling a diversity of actors to deal with these risks, I think is something that many of the existing funds are trying to work towards increasingly. But of course, you know, as we all accept, there's a way to go yet, in terms of really beginning to understand what it is that makes for effective adaptation, and therefore what makes for adaptation finance. So I think I've probably burned through my 10 minutes, and I should probably wrap up and leave it to the next speaker.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Smita. Thank you. Thank you. Now we have next Saliha to explain to us the experiences from us, has been described by Smita, one of the longest running adaptation funds out there, the LDCF and the SCF.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm having a little bit of trouble of distilling all the experience of the LDCF, SCCF in 10 minutes, but I will try to do my best. As you probably know, the GEF manages the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund. During the Marrakesh Accords in 2001, these two funds were created by the convention. And also at that time, the GEF was given the mandate to establish a strategic priority on adaptation. And this was actually the first program. It was a $50 million program on adaptation. The idea was to carry out pilot and demonstration projects on how adaptation could be translated into real adaptation benefits. Basically, this was the first program that was launched and also the first program that was completed. Now it's closed. Some projects are still under implementation, but that constitutes our first experience. The LDCF and the SCCF came afterwards, and at this point, we have about 170 projects in over 110 countries altogether from these three different funds. The projects together combined amount to $800 million. But what's interesting is that they're linked to so-called baseline investments. And these baseline investments are in the size of, to the tune of $4 billion. What I find also interesting, and this I think has implications, important implications for this debate, is that as the financing for LDCF and SCCF has grown, but more so for LDCF, what we have found is that the size of the projects has increased. There has been this natural tendency to scale up. So the LDCF projects, on average, have doubled in size over time. What we have found in the case of SCCF, which doesn't get as much support and is somehow less predictable in terms of financing than LDCF, is that the financing leverage by each SCCF dollar was $4.5 for the first 10 projects on average. And for the last 10 projects, the financing leverage by each dollar was 9.3, essentially doubling. And in addition to this trend of sort of mainstreaming into bigger interventions and sort of this tail of adaptation financing wagging a bigger dog over time, the GEF has seen this trend of scaled up approaches, programmatic approaches, projects or programs that combine funding from different focal areas of the GEF, such as biodiversity, land degradation, mitigation, along with the adaptation funding. And that has many benefits, including the fact that, for example, with mitigation, one of the barriers is demonstrating, in some cases, real benefits on the ground. With adaptation, that is rarely the case. And therefore, it's much easier to engage in some cases. So anyway, since May 2011, we have invested over $24.5 million in LDCF and SCCF funding in programmatic multifocal regional approaches. Actually, the number has grown since then. In addition, in combination, I should say, with over $100 million of other GEF financing from the GEF Trust Fund. And in addition to that, co-financing, the figure for which I don't have, but I've already given you the ratios on average. The thing about programs is that they provide a platform. This is what we're seeing for interested donors and other partners to build on, to invest, to redirect their investments in some cases. And this has been sort of one of the ways in which we've been grappling with this problem already mentioned of the current model, which is, we have a certain number of donors who, on a voluntary basis, provide funds to these trust funds. And that's the issue of scale of funding, which is woefully inadequate with respect to the problem, the scale of the problem, and the predictability of funding. Let me then segue into what LDCF and SCCF has been doing and intends to do more of, with the private sector being a promising source of leveraging financing for adaptation. Basically, what the LDCF and SCCF can do for government, this brings to mind some of the ideas mentioned by the colleague from the Bank of America. We can help take care of some of the barriers that private sector faces in terms of risk and, for example, entry into market. So we can help secure support from the government in the form of information, regulation, incentives. We can also help address sector-specific climate risks. For example, there's a specific potential for damages from climate change to ports or hydropower or agriculture, water-intensive industries. And so in countries or regions, there are industry associations that represent the interests of these sectors. And we are able to partner up to identify the risks and response strategies, for instance. We can also do awareness raising, capacity building, improve policy, regulatory environment, and help develop entrepreneurship. And this is in order to seize the emerging opportunities for the private sector to reduce vulnerabilities. I think I'll leave it at that pretty much. I just want to basically end on a closing. I want to close on a final sort of thought. Mitigation and adaptation continue to be intertwined. Our facilitators said they're twins, and the more I think about this, the more I see them as Siamese twins. Because basically, it's easier to adapt if we mitigate, obviously. But when we mitigate, at this point, what we're seeing is we have to take adaptation into consideration. There is no point in building green infrastructure if it's not going to withstand the current climate conditions. The infrastructure that was designed for some other climate, the climate of 20 years ago, is just not going to do. So I leave you with these thoughts, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Saliha, and for making reference to the metaphor of twins. Since we're talking about climate finance, you can also say they're two sides of the same coin. Now I open the floor without much ado because we have roughly, we don't want to curtail the time for this very important discussion, but roughly 15 minutes for the Q&A. Sir, please.
Thank you. Thank you. factual question. You mentioned, Salia, that the leveraging also doubled. What's the reason? Just because the projects got larger, or any other magic behind?
Yes, go ahead, Celia. Want to
Okay,
address
you can hear me. There are lots of reasons. I think, as you know, we work through 10 implementing agencies, and I think they've become more savvy over time, realizing that, earlier on we saw projects that had a lot more foundational type activities as a bigger proportion of the project as a whole. But now the agencies, I think over time, have also realized that they're able to influence their own infrastructure developments, which are much more expensive, using some of the funding that we provide in order to make it more resilient. And in fact, over time, what you see is that regional development banks or the World Bank, but I think especially some of the regional development banks that have been a little bit late in joining the game have become more active, and a lot of the co-financing that they provide is quite large. So I think that's probably the main reason.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
If adaptation is described as the glamorous twin, or as the other side of the same coin, how come it has not attracted more finance than mitigation? What is from a financing point of view, what could be the key differences between adaptation and mitigation? And say, for example, technology obsolescence or the size of the project, what could it be in your experience?
You have asked a million-dollar question, but before we give the floor to the panelists to respond to that, just like to see a show of hands for those who want to raise questions, so we'll have an idea how we manage time. So I see only one other hand, so yes, the panel.
Okay.
Would like to respond to that.
To tell you the truth, I think that the international awareness of the importance of adaptation, actually, let me plagiarize what Smita said. I think you said the imperative to act is no longer, ignorable. It's become evident that adaptation, despite our best mitigation efforts to date, adaptation is unavoidable, and I think the funding has increased. It hasn't increased to the scale it's needed, obviously, but we have seen a trend of increasing adaptation financing, which will hopefully continue and even grow. So at least I think, yes?
The other was in terms of looking at the risk and the perception of the investor in terms of adaptation versus mitigation. How does it differ to the funder?
That's a good question. I think the question is, how does the perception of the risk differ for mitigation projects, for instance, versus adaptation projects? Well, maybe this is part of an answer. I don't know if I have the full answer, but basically, one thing that I'm seeing is that I think estimating the cost of mitigation might be easier than estimating the cost of adaptation. And in the absence of having it's like, there isn't that much debate that adaptation is necessary. I think that's clear. The point at which we stumble is when we try to define the cost. That's a little difficult. The exact cost of adaptation. In the GEF, we call it the additional cost, which is even more complicated, I think, because where does business as usual stop and adaptation begin? So those things are a little bit difficult conceptually, and I think that's one of the possible barriers why it's a little bit difficult to attract investors. You can't really do a good cost-benefit analysis if you don't have the right costs. But sometimes, the evidence is overwhelming, and you sort of know that you have to do it anyway.
And so one of the quandaries on adaptation, how to calculate incremental cost, and we've never really arrived at a clear definition of that. But maybe, Juan, you might want to add on that, being very familiar with the issues being discussed in relation to scale. Yes, Juan.
Thank you, Yep. And actually, I think it's important that perhaps we'll be a little more nuanced when we talk about this whole idea of it being the other side of the same coin, because it's not quite as simple as just that. I mean, the truth is that the more mitigation that we do, then the less mitigation, the less adaptation that we will have to do. And therefore, so we're not talking of two symmetrical coins. It's perhaps just as a matter of stressing the linkages and the synergies between the two. One thing, and building on that, is the fact that a few years ago, we perhaps would have immediately rejected the notion of mitigation and adaptation working together, whereas we have now evolved to the point where we recognize very well the opportunities for these to be mutually supportive. That is, you know, in the same place where you might be having benefits from, say, off the top of my head, solar energy in remote areas. You are now you might be able to use that energy to cope with some of the heat waves, or to be able to preserve certain things. So you're starting to actually realize that, well, that same mitigation project has some also has adaptation benefits. So that might be to the issue of why we speak of the same coin, but it's certainly not as simple. But why have we failed to attract? Well, first because during the first good part, if not most of the first 15 years of the process under this convention, adaptation was always underplayed. Adaptation was more or less like where we don't want to go. You know, if we accept adaptation, we have accepted defeat, and we're now at the point where the science and the reality, when we look outside, tells us, well, it's not longer actually an option of to just kind of avoid it altogether. So that's why it's just catching up. Having said that, of course, there are some very specific issues that make it different. First of all, the return of investment in adaptation, both at the current and both in terms of time frames and scale of that return of investment, it's different. I'm not saying it's less, it's more, it's just different from mitigation, and we need to understand a little bit more that the nuance of that difference. The risk that we're dealing with, the risk that a project or a program might be exposed to, it's also quite different. I mean, when we talk of adaptation, we're often actually talking about specifically the very ugly things: sea level rise, floods, glaciers melting, etc. So it's a very different context that for example, when we talk about industry for greenhouse gases, as well as the issue of scale. It is a well-known fact among practitioners in adaptation that adaptation is often, the place to start is actually at the very bottom grassroots level. So putting a lot of these small actions together has a much more higher cost that, for example, say some sort of mitigation project in a coal factory. The issue of focus, it can be easily, as was said, this whole issue of like, well, are we really talking about development? Are we talking about, because if an adaptation project is well done, if it's actually looked into the long-term scenarios, then that means that actually we will never see the impacts. So it's very hard to judge really if it was effective or not, which makes it very different from mitigation. And lastly is the issue of uncertainty. And I'm just listing a few sort of the top of my head. It's the issue of uncertainty. To a great extent, we have, obviously, as we all know, an idea of what the trends or the impacts are, but it's very hard to give you a full-on sort of, by this date, the sea level will be at this point at this place. By this date, this glacier will have melted. These issues makes it very different from working with mitigation. And perhaps over coffee, I could come up with even more of why we're dealing with a different type of it's a different, perhaps maybe it's a different coin in the same pocket, but it's not the other side.
Thank you, Juan. You're gonna need a lot of coffee there. We'll take the question from Takashi.
I think agriculture is most vulnerable industry, and the science and the technology can offer a kind of solution. For instance, genetic modified crops could be a solution for after the change of the climate. My question is the GEF, did you have any experience to support and encourage the use of genetically modified crops for fitting the climate change?
That's a direct question to Saliha, but I'll also ask Carlos to comment on that since you've been involved in the technology negotiations for quite some time. Please.
All right. To my knowledge, we have not supported genetically modified crops so far, but we have supported projects that basically, like seed banks, that preserve the biodiversity, that conserve the biodiversity of different races of important crops, particularly those known. There's a project in Yemen, for instance, where farmers actually know which varieties are more resistant to droughts. And this is the kind of, this is basically the idea that, you want to have a bank of drought-resistant varieties. You want to maximize the biodiversity so that you have the kind that you will need under new climatic conditions. So we've definitely supported at least a few of such projects. Yeah. And I just want to also add that agriculture is basically is the largest part of our portfolio. So most of our projects, not most of our projects, but among the different sectors in which we operate, agriculture is the most prominent one, and food security, in particular for the LDCs, is an area in which we have done a lot of work.
Carlos, you want to comment on
Sure.
that? Yeah.
Certainly we recognize agriculture as one of the most vulnerable in the Caribbean region to the impacts of climate change and even climate variability. And the interventions that we have really been promoting and which we have implemented so far have been with irrigation, with drainage systems, putting in greenhouses, crop diversification, and so on. And in fact, where GMOs are concerned, it would really be against most of the policies of the Caribbean countries on the use of GMOs. As we see the niche markets that we have established using organic methods, and for example, with cacao and with various niche crops, that is really a high market for us. And really, it would be going against some national policies to introduction of GMOs in that area.
Thank you, Carlos. Once we start talking about specific things in adaptation, you probably realize the role of different stakeholders. But I'm not going to go beyond saying that. Yes, sir. And any other intervention from the floor? I'll take the one from the back, and then two actually from the back, and then we'll go back to you.
Good evening, colleagues and distinguished participants. My name is Rensi Panna, and I'm from Papua New Guinea. I'm here on behalf of my government. First of all, I am also compelled by the need to at least say something in support of my AOC's colleague up there in front. For us, PNG, my government has a very strong position on private sector involvement in terms of scaling up resources for adaptation. And one of the things that really interested me was the discussions and some of the lessons that were given by our 4 panelists up in the front. And I think a few of the points that I have noted were on the role of the government in fostering a domestic environment for private sector investment. And I think it would be my honor and privilege to also bring a domestic case study from my country to everyone in front of this room by first of all demonstrating the role of the private sector in terms of creating an environment for private sector involvement. For PNG, one of the reasons why we have so much private sector engagement was because of my government's initial responsibility to take on a private sector consulting firm to prepare our climate change adaptation strategy, which was more business environment friendly in terms of the innovative options for funding that were included in it. And one of the things that I also want to point out, and it would be something that the Standing Committee on Finance should also take into consideration, would be effective ways and means of ensuring the delivery of the adaptation financial resources in future. And one of the reasons why my government is looking for more creative and innovative approaches of engaging the private sector is because we have found out through our years of engagement with the multilateral agencies and the bilateral agencies, the various cumbersome processes that tend to delay implementation of financial resources in our countries. And we have also noted that there is a greater deal of interest from the private sector to work closely with the government. We're just looking forward to an overarching policy environment that can be established at these kind of forums to facilitate what we can do at the domestic level. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well. Unfortunately, we're running against time, both figuratively and literally. But so I have time only for the last question from the back, and no, 2 questions. That's it. So.
Is it working? Oh, yeah.
Kenta.
Thank you. My name is Kenta Ose from the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan. And my question is regarding the evaluation of adaptation projects, which I think some of you commented already. I think one of the fundamental challenge of adaptation project is that unlike the mitigation project, it's very difficult to sort of measure and evaluate how much achievement it's actually accomplished. In the mitigation, you can measure how much energy it's saved and hence how much greenhouse gas it emitted. But you can't do that for adaptation, and you cannot experiment these extreme weather conditions to test whether it actually worked. So which makes the entire cost effectiveness assessment very difficult before the project. And so I was wondering if any of you have any sort of innovative approaches in your institutions to actually evaluate this cost effectiveness of the adaptation projects. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take the last question and we'll ask the panel to respond, and we'll do the wrap-up.
Yeah, a very quick question. This is regarding the future of adaptation fund. I'm not sure whom I should target this question to. Maybe Juan or Saliha can respond to this. The sources of adaptation fund was, one of the sources was 2% proceeds of CDM. And in view of the declining value of CARs, which has gone less than $1, so what is your perception about the future of adaptation fund?
The first question relates to approaches in calculating.
Okay.
Yeah. Saliha.
I'll be happy to take the question on calculating adaptation. You're right, it is difficult to measure adaptation in the way that mitigation is sort of assessed and measured. But it's not impossible, and you know, we take a different approach. You know, the portfolio is still relatively young, the LDCF, SCCF's portfolio, so the actual impact of projects, I think, we'll really, truly only see years from now. But what we are doing is basically measuring the development baseline and measuring the development gains as a result of the project. I think if you demonstrate that the people are better off, that the risk is lower. For example, I'm thinking of an emblematic project we have, which is the Bhutan Glacial Lake Outburst Flood Prevention Project. And essentially, you would have floods occur every so often. I don't know now, you know, once every 5 years. But you put dams in place, you put early warning system and other disaster risk management measures, and you don't have that happening. You don't have people dying from, you know, these massive floods that would happen because the glaciers are melting rapidly and the glacial lakes are overflowing the capacity of their basins. So it is possible. Sometimes it is very difficult. I certainly agree with you. But you can link, I think what we are finding is that by linking the adaptation benefits to development, it works. This is a very simplistic answer. A more complex answer would take longer time. However, we do have adaptation monitoring and tracking tool. It's part of our results-based management system. It's available online, so please take a look at that and contact me if you have further questions.
Thank you. Two sentences, Carlos.
Certainly. We have been fortunate that the adaptation projects that we have implemented were really evidence-based adaptations. So, for example, in Dominica, where we put in an irrigation system, it was an area that was being used as a banana plantation, and with the irrigation system, the yield went up. We have a resource economist on staff who has then tracked what the increase in yield has been in that area. In St. Lucia, we knew what the company was paying for water in the hotel and what they're paying zero now. So again, we have been able to track that investment yield. And then in St. Lucia, in St. Vincent, where the saltwater reverse osmosis system was put in place, the government used to have to boat in the water from another, barge in the water from another island to that island. So we've been able to calculate what has been the cost saving in doing that. So there, we have been able to track in those three pilots what the cost savings has been in adaptation.
Thank you, Carlos. I know Juan will add a lot of value on the NME question. So Juan, I'll give you 30 seconds.
Well, let me then start right away. On the first question of environments, from our friend from P&G, absolutely. And if, for example, if we were to take one hazard in particular, floods, for example, if we were to actually then speak of adaptation in the context of the energy sector, the type of regulations from government that are needed will be quite different and might be synergistic, but it's also very different that speaking of the same hazard in the context of slums. So it really, I agree on the importance of enabling environments, as they're often called, but it is a little more complex than that. On the question on monitoring and evaluation, as I mentioned, the Adaptation Committee is currently organizing an actual workshop on this, where we will be looking at and very broadly will describe, the focus is to try to go from the current experience that is very much based on an individual project towards actually the monitoring and evaluation at a national level. The issue of actually trying to have a common definition of success at multiple timescales, and also of how to bring in learning into the actual sort of as a loophole, sorry, as a loop back into the implementation of projects. On the adaptation fund, lastly, I don't think that neither on behalf of the AAC, Bolivia, or myself, I can provide an answer to the future of the adaptation fund. I think that the importance of considering other sources is key, whether this be from all the way from carbon taxes to actually reinvesting some of the savings that might come from some mitigation activities, say, for example, energy efficiency. But I think what's important is that regardless of what happens, what has been achieved in terms of the experience with the governance, the experience with the evaluation and selection and prioritization of projects, and of setting up national institutions should be translated and should be used in other contexts, for example, in the development of the details of the GCF. Otherwise, it will be a rather dramatic loss to just sort of leave behind all those lessons.
Thank you, Juan. And unfortunately, as I said, we've run out of time. Smita, you want your 30 seconds? Well, please.
Yeah, I have one observation in response to the question around the adaptation fund, and I think the takeaway message from that is the importance of having diversified sources of funding, and that's actually not necessarily a lesson for the adaptation finance alone, it's a lesson for climate finance more generally. So having a variety of options and recognizing that many different sources of finance, even those we expected to be more predictable than donor contributions, may come with some uncertainty, is part of what makes the discussion around innovative sources of finance both important, but important to put in a diversified context. You need multiple inputs for climate finance to have predictability and scale.
Let me just say that I think my colleague who actually works on adaptation fund will be in a panel later on, so I think that will be a good time to pose this question.
Thank you, Salia, for that. Now we've come to the end of this session. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for being here, and let's give one more round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.